Palm Beach, 1985. A mansion of 126 rooms, its 58 bedrooms silent, its gold-plated taps tarnishing stands abandoned on 17 acres of prime ocean front. Built for presidents, yet deemed too costly for the nation, Mar-a-Lago was born from a serial fortune inherited after a suicide and shaped by obsession. When a real estate developer bought it for a fraction of its value, the fate of the Trump family's most infamous estate revealed how American dreams can turn into burdens nobody wants to claim. How did a palace meant for glory end as a white elephant waiting for rescue? Charles William Post was born in Springfield, Illinois, in 1854, the son of a restless entrepreneur and of a mother whose family traced its roots to the early American Midwest. From the beginning, Post's life was shaped by uncertainty and ambition, and that tension would follow him through success and collapse. As a young man, he cycled through business failures and health crises, enduring his first nervous collapse in 1885. By the time he reached his late 30s, another breakdown sent him to Dr. John Harvey Kellogg's sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan, a place famous for its new ideas about health and food. The treatment there was unconventional, but it offered Post a glimpse of something that would change his fortunes. Grain-based health foods served bland and promised as a cure for modern ills. When his money ran out, Post left the sanitarium, but he carried those lessons with him. In 1895, working out of a barn in Battle Creek, he created Posthume, a roasted grain beverage marketed as a wholesome alternative to coffee. The product found a ready audience, helped by advertisements that claimed it could cure everything from headaches to insomnia. 2 years later, Post introduced grape nuts, a cereal whose name suggested both energy and novelty. He built his business on bold promises and relentless marketing, often touting health benefits with little scientific proof. By 1901, sales of Posthume and grape nuts had soared. The company's annual earnings exceeded $1 million, a staggering sum at the turn of the century. Post became one of America's wealthiest men, his fortune built not on inherited land or old money, but on the power of invention and the reach of advertising. Battle Creek's factories ran day and night, churning out boxes stamped with his name. The cereal empire that grew from this small Michigan town would become the financial engine for a new kind of American opulence, one measured not just in dollars, but in the scale of dreams it could support. By 1911, the scale of C.W. Post's ambitions had outgrown the cereal mills of Michigan. His wealth, once a measure of invention, began to fund projects less rational and more grandiose. In the flat expanse of West Texas, he carved out Post City, a planned community built from scratch, named for himself, meant to prove that prosperity could be imposed on the prairie. He imported trees, laid out streets, and built a hotel, a school, and a cotton gin. The town was an assertion of control, a monument to a man who refused to let chance dictate his legacy. But, for Post, order was always threatened by forces beyond his reach. Labor unrest swept the country, and he responded with relentless anti-union campaigns. Strikes at his factories were met with firings and blacklists. He hired detectives to monitor workers, convinced that discipline alone could hold chaos at bay. The more he tried to suppress dissent, the more it seemed to multiply, feeding a sense of siege that no amount of money could dispel. The Texas droughts of the early 19-teens brought a new obsession. Convinced that rain could be summoned by force, Post poured thousands of dollars into experiments that bordered on the fantastical. He ordered crates of dynamite and hired crews to set off explosions along the Caprock Escarpment in hopes of coaxing moisture from the sky. Local newspapers chronicled the spectacle, thunderous blasts echoing across empty fields, clouds of dust rising, but no rain falling. Each attempt cost over $10,000, a fortune detonated in the pursuit of control over nature itself. Those years saw Post's fortunes swell, but also the first signs of unraveling. The campaigns against labor, the failed rainmaking, the relentless drive to impose order, each became more desperate as his health faltered. Chronic pain and insomnia crept into his days. The fortune that had once promised freedom became a burden, fueling schemes that grew more erratic as the pressure mounted. In the shadow of his empire, The limits of willpower and wealth became impossible to ignore. In the spring of 1914, C.W. Post boarded a private train bound for Rochester, Minnesota. Chronic pain had settled deep in his abdomen, a consequence, doctors believed, of an old appendicitis left to fester. At the Mayo Clinic, surgeons operated in early March, but the promise of relief faded almost as soon as the anesthesia wore off. The pain persisted. Post left the clinic with the weight of disappointment pressing on him, returning to his Santa Barbara home with little hope for recovery. The months that followed were marked by isolation and silence. Family members and business associates watched as his energy drained away. Medical notes from the period describe a man beset by insomnia, digestive agony, and a sense of futility that no fortune could ease. The empire he had built, factories, towns, a cereal brand recognized in every American kitchen, offered no comfort against the reality of a failing body. On the morning of May 9, 1914, Post retreated to a quiet room in his California estate. He was 59 years old. With a rifle, he ended his own life, leaving behind a single daughter and a business whose future now rested on her shoulders. Probate records filed in Los Angeles County that summer made it official. Marjorie Merriweather Post, age 27, became the sole owner of a fortune valued at $33 million. She inherited not just wealth, but the presidency of Postum Cereal Company, with board minutes confirming her appointment within a week of her father's death. There were no legal contests. The will was clear, the succession immediate. In a matter of days, the Post empire passed from a man whose drive had bordered on obsession to a young woman who had attended board meetings since childhood. The abruptness of the transfer, sealed by tragedy, would shape Marjorie's life, and the fate of every grand project that followed. Within days of her father's death, Marjorie Merriweather Post became the sole owner of an empire that stretched from the cereal mills of Michigan to the cotton fields of Texas. The will left no room for debate. At 27, she controlled an estate valued at more than $30 million, a sum that placed her among the wealthiest Americans of her time. Probate filings listed not only the Postum Cereal Company, but also vast real estate holdings, cash reserves, and an inventory of assets that filled dozens of pages. Board minutes from that first summer confirm what few women of the era could claim. Marjorie was named president, with the authority to direct every aspect of the business. She had attended meetings since childhood, sometimes perched on a stack of ledgers to see over the table. Now her signature alone could authorize new ventures, acquisitions, or the sale of entire divisions. The company's directors, all men decades her senior, recorded their votes in the formal language of the time, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Post fortune, built on invention, risk, and relentless marketing, would continue under her command. In the months that followed, Marjorie moved between the family's residences in Battle Creek and New York, reviewing balance sheets and meeting with bankers. The scale of the operation was daunting. Postum's annual revenues exceeded $1 million, with cash reserves that dwarfed most competitors. Factories ran on tight schedules, and labor unrest lingered in the background. Yet Marjorie proved adept at navigating the boardroom, relying on a mix of inherited caution and her own instinct for opportunity. She listened more than she spoke, studied reports late into the night, and insisted on clear lines of authority. Her control was not symbolic. Within the first year, she approved the modernization of production lines and began laying the groundwork for future acquisitions. She understood that the company's cash position, fortified by her father's prudence, offered a rare advantage. In an age when few women signed corporate checks, Marjorie signed dozens each week, funding research, expansion, and the pursuit of new markets. The world she entered was not designed for her, but she made its rules serve her purposes. The Postum Cereal Company, once the vision of a single troubled man, now belonged to a young woman determined to shape its future on her own terms. By the early 1920s, Marjorie Merriweather Post was not content to simply preserve what she had inherited. She looked beyond the safety of cereal profits, scanning the horizon for new opportunities. In 1925, she authorized the acquisition of Jell-O, a household name whose wobbly dessert had become a fixture at American tables. The deal brought not only a popular product, but a distribution network that stretched from coast to coast. 2 years later, she set her sights on Maxwell House, a coffee brand with deep Southern roots and national ambitions. The purchase, finalized in 1928, added a caffeinated jolt to the company's portfolio and signaled a willingness to compete with giants. Each transaction was bold, but none compared to the gamble she took in 1929. Clarence Birdseye, an inventor obsessed with the science of food preservation, had perfected a method to freeze vegetables and meats without destroying their texture or flavor. His company, still in its infancy, seemed a risky bet in a world accustomed to ice boxes and canned goods. Marjorie saw a future others could not. She paid $22 million for Birdseye's patents and operations, a sum that dwarfed even the largest deals of the era. The ink dried on the contract just months before the stock market collapsed in October 1929, sending shockwaves through the global economy. The Postum cereal company did not retreat. Instead, Marjorie merged her acquisitions under a new banner, General Foods. The name reflected a vision that stretched beyond cereal, beyond breakfast, into every corner of the American kitchen. Her leadership, unusual for a woman in the boardrooms of the 1920s, was marked by a calculated daring. She understood that scale and diversity were the only defenses against the volatility of modern markets. Personal life and business often collided. Marjorie's marriages, 4 in total, brought shifting alliances and new perspectives, but her grip on the company remained steady. Board minutes from the period show her signature on every major decision, from product launches to capital investments. She was both heiress and architect, building an empire designed to outlast any single generation. By the close of the decade, General Foods stood as a colossus. Annual revenues soared, and the company's reach extended into nearly every American home. It was this financial strength, nurtured by risk, secured by acquisition, that would later bankroll visions far more extravagant than a cereal box or a frozen pea. The fortune that began in a Battle Creek barn now waited to be translated into stone, tile, and gold along the shores of Palm Beach. In the winter of 1923, Marjorie Merriweather Post arrived in Palm Beach with a purpose that defied the conventions of her peers. She did not seek an address along the established avenues, nor did she wish to inherit the faded grandeur of another family's estate. Instead, she walked the undergrowth herself, tracing the narrowest strip of land where the Atlantic meets Lake Worth. 17 acres, wild and tangled, stretched from ocean surf to the inland lake, a rare parcel that offered both sunrise and sunset, and the isolation required for her plans. Land records from the county clerk's office show her purchase finalized that spring, a transaction that drew curiosity from local realtors accustomed to more modest ambitions. Mar-a-Lago came quickly as a name, Spanish for sea to lake. It was not a boast, but a statement of fact. Marjorie saw the estate as a bridge between two worlds, one foot in the old order of Gilded Age display, the other in a future she intended to shape. The site's orientation, east to west, allowed for a central axis that would carry sea breezes through cloistered halls and open loggias, a deliberate contrast into the boxy, shaded mansions that lined the avenue behind her. To realize this vision, she turned to Marion Sims Wyeth, a young architect whose Beaux-Arts training promised technical mastery and restraint. Wyeth's early sketches show a structure divided by a central cloister, with wings angled to capture light and frame the water. But Marjorie's ambitions soon outgrew even his careful plans. She wanted not just a house, but a stage for spectacle, a place where every arrival became an entrance, every room an act of theater. Joseph Urban, the Viennese designer known for his opera sets, entered the project soon after. Where Wyeth favored symmetry and order, Urban layered on color, ornament, and fantasy. The collaboration was uneasy from the start, but Marjorie insisted on both men, believing that tension would produce something new. Letters from Urban to his New York studio describe a client who arrived with samples of Spanish tiles and Venetian glass, demanding that each element serve both function and drama. By the end of 1923, the brief was set. A palace of 58 bedrooms, double cloisters, a tower rising above the palms, all anchored to the landscape by imported stone and antique tile. The estate would be both fortress and theater, its name inscribed on deeds and blueprints long before the first stone was laid. Marjorie's vision, shaped by loss and fortune, now had a setting as deliberate as any stage, and collaborators chosen as much for their differences as their skill. Construction began in 1923, and almost nothing about Mar-a-Lago's creation followed the logic of ordinary building. 3 boatloads of fossil-rich limestone crossed the Atlantic from Genoa, their pale surfaces destined for walls, arches, and sculpted animals that would weather quickly in the Florida sun. The project called for 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, many salvaged from ruined monasteries and palaces, each one numbered and mapped for precise placement. 15th-century fragments mingled with new tiles fired in kilns across the Atlantic, their patterns echoing Moorish courts and Venetian loggias. 20,000 Cuban roofing tiles, in shades from salmon to black, arrived by freighter and rail, stacked in endless rows behind the rising walls. The living room alone stretched 1,800 square feet, under a ceiling that soared 42 feet above the floor, a replica of the 1,000-wing ceiling from the Accademia in Venice, recreated by artisans who worked from photographs and memory. Massive windows, some 12 feet high, were shipped from Europe in crates lined with straw, their glass panes etched and leaded to catch the shifting light from the sea. Italian carvers and Viennese sculptors spent months on site, coaxing parrots, rams' heads, and griffins from the limestone, while Joseph Urban directed the installation of whimsical ironwork and painted ceilings. Barrels of gold leaf arrived from New York, destined for bathroom fixtures and cornices, chosen not only for their shine, but, as Marjorie insisted, because gold was easier to clean than silver. The logistics rivaled those of a small railroad. Shipments arrived by barge, then by truck, with ledgers recording the passage of each crate from dock to storeroom. Marble blocks from a Cuban castle, over 2,000 square feet, were cut and numbered before crossing the Gulf. Surf-polished stones gathered from Long Island beaches were laid in geometric patterns across the lakeside patio, their placement inspired by the Alhambra's courtyards. By the time the last scaffolding came down in 1927, the estate counted 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms, and a 75-foot tower that rose above the palms. The final bill reached $7 million, a sum that would top $120 million today. Every imported tile, every carved animal, every ounce of gold leaf spoke to a vision that refused compromise. Marjorie's palace was not simply built, it was assembled, stone by stone, from the far edges of the Atlantic world. The result was a kind of material theater, its grandeur inseparable from the effort and extravagance that made it possible. Opening night at Mar-a-Lago was less a party than an announcement. Palm Beach society, drawn by invitation and curiosity, drifted through the double cloisters and tiled arcades, past fountains lit to shimmer like Venetian canals. The ballroom, hung with gold and crowded with orchids, became a stage for spectacle. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not simply host galas, she orchestrated them. Society columns from the late 1920s read as a roll call of the era's elite. Ambassadors, financiers, opera stars, and politicians mingled under ceilings painted with mythic scenes. The estate's guestbooks, still preserved in archives, record names that would fill a diplomatic ledger. Yet the grandest events were not always for the powerful. In 1929, the Ringling Brothers Circus unloaded its wagons on the lawn. For a single afternoon, acrobats and elephants performed for hundreds of local children, many of them from orphanages or families battered by the Depression. Marjorie stood at the edge of the crowd, her attention fixed not on the dignitaries but on the children's faces as they watched the trapeze swing above the imported marble. The press described the day as a gift to the city, a gesture that blurred the line between charity and theater. Winter after winter, Mar-a-Lago pulsed with activity. Red Cross fundraisers, Salvation Army teas, and seasonal balls filled the calendar. The estate's kitchens, staffed by chefs imported from New York and Paris, turned out meals for hundreds. Portraits from these years show Marjorie in tailored gowns, her posture as precise as the floral arrangements that lined the tables. She moved through her palace as both host and director, ensuring that each guest found a place in the choreography of the evening. But the rhythm of celebration could not last. The Second World War brought a different kind of guest. In the early 1940s, Mar-a-Lago's bedrooms were given over to the U.S. Navy. Hospital beds replaced 4 poster canopies, and the sound of laughter faded beneath the routines of rehabilitation. The estate's vast rooms, designed for spectacle, became corridors for convalescence. War records from the period list Mar-a-Lago among the facilities used for wounded servicemen, a palace repurposed by necessity. After the war, the house stood mostly empty. Photographs from the late 1940s show shutters drawn against the Florida sun, lawns trimmed but deserted, fountains silent. The society columns that once chronicled every gathering grew quiet. Marjorie visited less often, finding the echo of empty rooms a poor substitute for the life that once filled them. The estate, built for endless company, now kept its own counsel. In the silence, the grandeur remained, but its purpose seemed to waver, a shell awaiting the next act, uncertain if it would ever return to its former glory. By the late 1970s, Mar-a-Lago stood at the intersection of grandeur and burden, a palace too extravagant for private heirs, yet too costly for the nation it was meant to serve. Marjorie Merriweather Post's will offered the estate to the federal government as a presidential retreat, accompanied by a $100,000 annual maintenance endowment. But the arithmetic of stewardship had shifted. Internal budget memoranda from the General Services Administration and the National Park Service projected annual expenses climbing toward $1 million, citing the corrosive salt air, hurricane risk, and the relentless demands of historic preservation. Security alone required around-the-clock staffing across more than 17 acres. Federal officials weighed the offer in hearings and closed-door reviews, their language measured but unsparing. The estate's gold-plated fixtures, imported marbles, and antique tiles, once symbols of American achievement, became liabilities in the ledgers. Congressional analyses referenced Act No. 96586, passed in December 1980, which authorized the return of Mar-a-Lago to the Post Foundation. The government's rationale was pragmatic. Even with Post's endowment, the upkeep would outpace any allowance and drain public funds for a property whose utility could not justify its expense. The rejection was not a matter of taste or sentiment, but of fiscal logic. Maintenance projections dwarfed the original bequest. The estate, now a National Historic Site and listed on the National Register, was set adrift in the private market. The Post Foundation listed Mar-a-Lago at $20 million, but buyers proved elusive. Without a steward willing to absorb the costs, the mansion faced not just vacancy, but the prospect of demolition. Its future determined not by vision, but by the arithmetic of excess. In the silence of empty rooms and shuttered halls, the dream of a winter White House faded into a ledger entry, awaiting a new owner who could afford its care. In the winter of 1985, a deed was recorded in Palm Beach County that would redraw the boundaries of American ambition. The estate known as Mar-a-Lago, once priced at $20 million and burdened by $1 million a year in upkeep, changed hands for just $8 million. The transaction was not the result of simple market decline or a lack of interested buyers. It was the outcome of a negotiation that relied on leverage, calculation, and the peculiar vulnerabilities of a property too grand for its own good. Donald Trump began by acquiring a narrow 1.3-acre strip of beachfront just to the east of Mar-a-Lago. The parcel, purchased for $3 million, was not valuable for what it contained, but for what it could obstruct. For the Post Foundation, still seeking a buyer after years of empty listings, the prospect of a wall of condominiums rising between Mar-a-Lago and the Atlantic threatened to erase the estate's defining feature, its unbroken view from sea to lake. The original vision, inscribed in deeds and blueprints, depended on that axis. Without it, the property's value would collapse further. Trump's intentions were clear in public statements and private meetings. The offer to build was not a promise, but a warning. The Post Foundation faced a simple choice: accept a discounted sale or risk watching the estate's last advantage disappear behind new construction. Under pressure, the trustees relented. The final sale price for Mar-a-Lago was recorded at $8 million, a fraction of its appraised worth and less than half the original asking price. The furnishings, cataloged and appraised separately, were auctioned for another $3.5 million. Estimates had valued the collection closer to $8 million, but the realities of a distressed market and the need for a single, committed buyer left little room for sentiment. The transfer included chandeliers, Venetian antiques, and custom fixtures, pieces designed for rooms whose scale defied replication. The purchase, completed amid the ruins of Florida's land fever, was not simply a bargain. It was an assertion of control, achieved through the careful reading of property deeds and the exploitation of a moment when even the grandest dreams could be acquired at a discount. Stewardship of Mar-a-Lago now belonged to a new owner, one who saw in its excess not a burden, but an opportunity. The business model that finally preserved Mar-a-Lago did not begin with a government grant or an act of Congress, but with a membership ledger. By the mid-1990s, the estate's survival depended less on private fortune than on the willingness of hundreds to pay for a place at the table. The club's initiation fee began at $200,000, a sum that rivaled the purchase price of many Palm Beach homes. Annual dues and event revenues funded a restoration that kept faith with the original design, even as new demands pressed against the old walls. The most conspicuous addition was a ballroom, 20,000 square feet of marble, crystal, and gold leaf, built at a reported cost of $7 million. The room's scale eclipsed anything in Marjorie Post's original plans, yet its ornamentation echoed the theatrical excess of Joseph Urban's interiors. Here, galas unfolded beneath gilded ceilings, and international guests mingled with club members, each gathering inscribed in the ledger as both spectacle and transaction. Inclusion at Mar-a-Lago was not restricted by the codes that shaped the old Palm Beach order. The club welcomed those excluded elsewhere. Jewish, Black, and gay members were admitted in a town where tradition had long set the rules. The staff, drawn from across the region, balanced the demands of historic preservation with the logistics of modern hospitality. Maintenance costs, often reaching 7 figures each year, were met not by a single benefactor, but by the steady inflow of dues, event fees, and private bookings. Diplomacy, too, found a new stage within these walls. Heads of state and foreign dignitaries dined where circus performers once entertained orphans. The estate's original purpose, presidential grandeur, was realized, but only through commerce. Mar-a-Lago became a monument that could afford its own memory, its preservation secured not by inheritance, but by the economics of perpetual reinvention. Mar-a-Lago's gilded halls stand not just as architecture, but as evidence that America's grandest ambitions often outlast those who dream them. As wealth cycles through tragedy, reinvention, and spectacle, the question remains, who inherits responsibility for places too costly to abandon? In an age where fortunes rise and fall overnight, even palaces must justify their existence, or risk becoming monuments to the price of excess. Thank you for watching.